Imagine yourself reading a magazine, if you will. You turn the pages carelessly, paying no attention to the colorful ads that are carefully placed among the lengthy articles that are the reason you purchased that magazine in the first place. However, those ads, have you ever once stopped and thought, what are those ads saying? What do they imply about having someone of a certain gender, race, or age do something specific? Sometimes the meaning is deeper than the ink. Hello, my name is Jeffrey Cook.
And I'm Brittany Burke.
Our project is to explore ads from the 1960s onward to modern day.
We wanted to see what changes had been made to the kind of advertisements and how these ads had progressed over time. Specifically, we wanted to see what kind of representation some groups of people have had in these ads. This representation can be seen with how many times these groups appear in advertisements, but also what kinds of products these groups are used to advertise.
For a long time, these ads projected common ideas about certain groups in society, these ideas bordering on the lines of prejudice. However, these ideas have evolved with social norms.
When we were looking at groups that have been represented in magazine advertisements, we concentrated on 3 groups in particular.
We will first explore how African Americans have been represented, comparing then and now magazine ads in order to show of any change in the last 50 years.
We will then look at the changes in women and how they have appeared in the ads that populate magazines.
We will finally look over how the elderly have been shown in advertisements.
When Jeffrey and I were looking for magazine advertisements from the past that featured African Americans, many of the pictures we found were smoking advertisements. One of the pictures shown here is an ad for Kent cigarettes. Kent was an advertiser that specifically targeted blacks in advertising. Therefore, they used blacks to advertise the product. Many other advertisers avoided using African Americans because they were not the target audience for the product. The other 2 advertisements, pictured here, are 2 examples of other advertisers that used African Americans in their ads. African Americans were featured in many fewer advertisements than whites. Portrayals of African Americans in magazine advertisements have been very skewed in the past. According to a study by Ronald Humphrey and Howard Schuman, 75% of blacks were represented as low-skilled laborers such as cooks, servants, and porters, and 62% of African Americans were portrayed as being in subordinate relationships with whites. Blacks were never presented in dominant roles in the 1950s and early 1960s. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, there was a dramatic shift in the portrayals of African Americans in magazine advertisements. As you have hopefully noticed, there are many more advertisements featuring African Americans nowadays than in the past. These advertisements also display African Americans in a different light. By 1980, only 14% of African Americans in magazine advertisements were portrayed as low-skilled laborers. African Americans were also presented in equal roles with whites in 89% of advertisements. By the 1980s, African Americans were on a more equal level with whites, but there were and are still differences between African Americans and whites in magazine advertising today. For example, there is still a relative lack of African Americans in ads showing wealthy people at leisure. Shown in this slide are some examples of African Americans in more recent magazine advertisements.
In the early years, from the 1960s to the 1970s, there were many common trends. The trends were mainly subjective when it came to common traits that were expressed from these magazine ads. These traits portrayed that women are dependent and needs men's protection, and that men regard women primarily as sex objects. They are not interested in women as people, Wagner and Banos. These traits are demonstrated through ads presented, such as the one on the right where the ad implies that a woman belongs on the same level as a man's foot, or the ad where the woman has smoke blown on her face, and somehow she is now under the control of the man, implying this sort of mind control that men have over women. The final ad demonstrates how women are more considered furniture rather than equals or even human beings. In more modern advertisements, some of these ads are still around. However, these ads shown here are less and less as time goes on. Women have had more advertisements where they are shown having jobs or participating in sports. However, there are still issues with stereotyping. In ads, it is not as often that it is shown that women are 1. Interacting with other female coworkers in working situations, 2. Operating independently of men in buying big-ticket items such as cars and major appliances, and 3. Participating in activities involving institutions such as banks, mass media, and industrial firms, Wagner and Banos.
In the past, the elderly have been very underrepresented in many types of advertising, especially magazine advertising. In a study of the elderly in magazine advertisements, Anthony, Michael, and Virginia Ersick found that between 1950 and 1980, only 469 out of 5,195 magazine articles contained one or more elderly persons. In 1950, only 54 magazines, of all the magazines studied, contained an elderly person, but by 1980, 91 ads contained an elderly person. The elderly were not used for many advertising purposes, but they were most often used in alcohol, car, truck, and bank magazine advertisements. Pictured here are some examples of the elderly in advertisements for medical products. On this slide, there are some more current advertisements containing the elderly. One is an ad for the Dove products, and the other is an advertisement for Depends. Seeing the elderly in advertisements for brands that manufacture beauty products, such as Dove, is relatively new to our society. Some companies, such as Dove, are helping to end the underrepresentation of the elderly in advertising by using real people in ads instead of young models. In advertising today, there are more representations of the elderly in magazine advertisements, but the elderly are still underrepresented in ads. A study by Robert T. Peterson in 1992 found that out of the 215 magazine advertisements aimed at the general public, only 11 contained a person aged 65 or older, but out of 99 ads specifically aimed at persons aged 45 or older, 32 ads, or 33%, contained an elderly person. Peterson also found that the elderly are more likely to be portrayed in a negative light than their younger counterparts, but not by a significant amount. The elderly may be pictured in magazine advertisements more now than in past years, but there is still underrepresentation.
Over time, the representations of each group of people have changed. All 3 groups of people, African Americans, women, and the elderly, were all underrepresented in magazine advertisements in the past. Over time, this has changed. There are more advertisements that utilize these groups of people to sell products. This change in representation can be attributed to many things, including the evolution of social norms over time. People have created a new era where the representation of people are becoming more accurate and more equal. Thank you for watching our video. Now, please leave a comment below. This is so that Professor McCormick knows that you watched the video. The comments do not need to be any longer than a paragraph. Thank you very much.